Good morning. My name is Diane K. Gelder, and I serve as the Outreach Trustee on your DuPage UU Church Board of Trustees. We want to welcome everyone this morning to our open and inclusive virtual community. As Unitarian Universalists, we hold that there are many spiritual paths to truth and meaning, and pledge to support one another as we explore these paths. We are so glad you were able to find us and join us for our live-streamed service today. Please check the church website at www.dupageuchurch.org for updates. If you search under DuPage UU Church on Facebook, you will find a number of ways to be in community with us as well. Please join us today for virtual coffee hour after the service. The Zoom link is in the order of service and on the Members tab of our website. You may join us around 11:30 a.m., and at 11:45, we will break into small groups of 4 to 5 people chosen at random. Chat with old friends or make new ones. We hope to see you there. We have an announcement this morning. DuPage UU Church's annual meeting will take place in 2 weeks on Sunday, June 6th this year, using the same virtual by Zoom format as last year. 2 items on the agenda offer pre-meeting forums to provide information and time for questions. The next 2021 budget review will be held on Thursday, May 27. And the policy-based governance review forums will be held on Sunday, May 30, and Wednesday, June 2. Please check last week's Thursday Weekly and the separate email sent on Friday for forum dates, times, and Zoom links. And for all annual meeting details, including the forum information, you may visit dupageuchurch.org/2021 annual meeting or find the link on the Members Page tab on our website.
I switched a couple things on our order of service, the reason for which will become obvious in a moment. For our chalice sliding, we're going to hear from one of our young members, Ben.
We tender this flame, opening the book, turning to a page yet to be written. Opening a story yet to be told, may we fill this fresh page wisely. May we write a new story into being. May we together inscribe the page with hope.
Thank you. The light of this chalice reminds us that it is a symbol of the world's religions, This small light shines as do the fires burn to ward off the darkness and welcome back the sun in the Celtic and Native American faiths, as do the Jewish Shabbat candles and the Christian altar candles, as do the oil lamps of the Hindu Diwali and the candles of Buddhism. And it is a symbol of the light inside each of us, as recognized by Muslims. It is a symbol of the sun and evolution, as studied by humanists. As we have lit this chalice, may we be reminded that this light is a symbol that ties us to many faiths, beliefs, traditions, and customs from which we can learn and enrich our lives. Blessed be. I invite you to join your voices in song. Our opening hymn is number 323 in the gray hymnal, Break Not the Circle.
Please join me in saying and singing our written and sung affirmations. Love is the spirit of this church, and service its law. This is our great covenant, to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in love, and to help one another.
It is time to gather. Our theme this month is story. And today I have a story about a man with a story. It's a story about stories, if you will. Once upon a time, there was a man with a story. And this wasn't any old once upon a time story, not one you could fill on a bookshelf or hear around the campfire. This was his story and no one else's. The story had been carefully crafted. It began before he was born, and this story told of his loves and fears, his dreams realized, and his dreams yet to come. This story was complete. It was told his whole life, including those bits that still existed in his imagination. In fact, this story was so complete, and he was so happy with his story that he carried it around to make sure it was safe. It was somewhat bulky and unwieldy, but he didn't mind. It was his story. The thing about the story was, it was very fragile, made up of many pieces and held together by only his own imagination. And he was worried that it might break apart at any minute. And so he grew more and more protective of his story, and he held it even closer. And as he went about his life, he checked on the story to make sure he was following it correctly. He avoided adventure and unknowns because, well, they might break the story. And then one day, the inevitable happened. Without warning, his story broke. It was unforeseen, and he hadn't done anything wrong at all. But there it was, laying in 1,000 shattered pieces on the ground, with the sunlight glinting off the bits of story he had so carefully protected for all those years. He was heartbroken. And since his story hadn't said to put the pieces back together, he was at a loss. What now? And he sat down next to the pile of pieces and cried. A while later, maybe it was minutes, maybe it was hours, a group of people came out of the nearby building and saw him sitting on the sidewalk, surrounded by a pile of broken pieces, clearly in need of help. "What happened here?" a woman asked. "My story, it's gone. I worked so hard to build it, to protect it, to keep it from harm, but now it's gone. Gone," he wailed. "Is this the story here?" a man asked. "Yes, look at it. There's nothing left of it." "It looks like it's here, not gone," said a child. "We just have to put it back together." "Put it back together? There's no way. You don't even know what it looked like. How will you put it back together if you don't even know me?" Well, the child was tenacious. "Don't worry. With all of us here to help, we'll put it back together in a way that you would never even expect. You never know. It might be more beautiful than before." And so they swept up all the pieces of this man's story carefully and went together into the building from which they emerged. And they poured him some hot coffee and sang a song he had never heard before, something about coming again and again, though you've broken your vows 1,000 times. The song was soothing, and the coffee was warm. He began to feel hope again, that his story could be put back together. And it took a long time. Maybe it was days, maybe it was years, but they all got it back together. And they added new parts, and some old parts didn't fit anymore, but that was okay. And the child had been right. It was more beautiful than before. And this time, the story was held together not only by his imagination, but by the imagination and support of an entire community. It wasn't nearly so fragile, and it even allowed for adventure.
This reading is adapted from a reflection by the Reverend Emily Gage. My whole childhood was lived on one block of a neighborhood in Pittsburgh, but my horizons were much, much wider. From a very young age, I was transported by stories to worlds far and near. I ate too many cookies with Frog and Toad, made footprints in the snow with Peter in a snowy day, spied on the neighbors with Harriet, listened to Pa's fiddle in the evening along with Laura Ingalls, laughed and cried with the great Gilly Hopkins, found out what happened next with Gene Fitz's Paul Revere, solved the mystery with Turtle in the Westing game, and so on, and so on, and so on. The list is endless. And all these people, these stories, both fictional and non-fictional, are part of who I am. Stories shape us in so many ways, whether they resonate with our own experience, tell us something about who we are. When they jolt us into a new perspective, they broaden our sense of the world. When they share where we have come from, they remind us that we are all part of a larger narrative. The complexity of this is staggering. Salman Rushdie put it this way in his book, Midnight's Children. Who and what am I? My answer, I am everyone and everything. Everyone whose being in the world was affected by mine. I am anything that happens after I've gone, which would not have happened if I had not come. Nor am I particularly exceptional in this matter. Each I, every one of the now 600 million plus of us, contains a similar multitude. I repeat for the last time, to understand me, you'll have to swallow the world. In some ways, it could be argued, each one of us is a community or a collection of stories. That is, in part, what this month's theme is all about. But we must also ask this question in a broader sense. What does it mean for DuPage Unitarian Universalist Church to be a community of story? Part of what we do, of course, is listen to one another's stories. We do this in the joys and sorrows portion of our worship service, in informal conversation at coffee hour, or while our kids play. We witness shared celebrations of our stories, whether they be baby dedications or memorial services or other rites of passage. We create narratives of what could be in our faith in action gatherings and marches. Sometimes just sharing our story and having it be held by others is helpful. Sometimes hearing a story that sounds like yours, but with a different ending, can give you hope. Sometimes listening to someone whose perspective is totally different opens up new worlds and new understandings. In our religious community, we are shaped by the stories we encounter. In our religious community, we create a shared story of who we are and who we may become. May we open our minds and hearts to all the stories we encounter this month, both from our own lives and from the lives of those around us.
Thank you, Joe. It occurs to me that many things have just felt more difficult in the last year. I was in a church meeting this morning at the budget forum, and it occurred to me there that it might feel to some like it's been more difficult to be involved this last year because we've all been so isolated. Yesterday, some of us gathered here because we held a memorial service for a longtime church member, Lois I messed this up yesterday too, Schnitzline. And what occurred to me then, because this was a memorial service that came almost a year after she had passed, that it has even been more difficult to grieve when we can't gather together. It also occurs to me that it's been more difficult to celebrate joys, all of the birthdays of the last year, the graduations recently. So many joys and sorrows throughout our community that we would normally celebrate together. Celebrate or recognize together. And that's been more difficult. We light this candle of joys and sorrows to symbolize all of those joys and sorrows that we wish that we could support each other in, but for which we are sitting home, some of us alone, dealing with these on our own. In this month, with a worship theme of story, I thought it would be interesting to look at the first kind of stories, which are found in mythology. I've always found mythology and folklore to be a fascinating subject. As a child, I was captivated by the drama and magic of the old stories. All the heroes and villains, the quest or the hero's journey, the discoveries, rewards, and punishments, as well as the morals of the stories that actually said some truth about humanity. As an adult in college, I learned of the work of the great mythographer Joseph Campbell, who used as the lens through which he studied cross-cultural myths, theories from the archetypal psychology work of Carl Jung. Psychology puts forth the idea that there is inherent truth or wisdom to be gleaned from any story, from your dreams, and from other ways in which we understand the world around us, even if these stories are not literal or factual. Our minds are seething hotbeds of fantastical ideas that contain some inner truth about our own lives. These stories, these dreams, are part of our own personal mythologies. I've learned that in every myth, every story that we tell, there is a moral, some metaphorical meaning, a lesson to be taught and learned. Sometime in the early years of Christianity, becoming established in Rome, the Greek word for story, which is myth is the Greek word for story, began to take on the definition of falsehood. And so it has become common to use the word myth when we're talking about something that is not real. However, as you may have heard me say before, myth has always meant story, and stories serve some other purpose besides the rote recitation of historical facts. So let me give you a little bit of background about the work of psychoanalyst Carl Jung, in which he described archetypes as the missing link between the mind and myths. This was important to him because he, like Joseph Campbell after him, had noted the cross-cultural similarities in mythologies from people around the world. One theory for similarities for disparate myths that contain, for example, dark forests and great floods, the stealing of fire, and gifts from the gods, that theory is cultural diffusion. For example, when one considers that Proto-Celtic people walked from India to northern and western Europe over many generations, it makes sense that there may be similarities in stories from India and Ireland, and there are similarities. However, there was no known early interactions between cultures in, say, South Africa and Siberia. So how could their stories have any similarities? Carl Jung theorized about the collective unconscious, a cultural repository shared by all humanity. The concept is that we are all born and raised, enculturated with ideas and beliefs that come from this collective unconscious. And the templates for these ideas and beliefs that arise from our unconscious, these great ideas that show up in so many different stories across the world, were called by Jung archetypes. You may be familiar with many archetypes, even if you've never really been familiar with Jungian psychology. In Western culture, we find the Great Father or Sky Father and the Blessed Son of the Father. These archetypes loom quite large in our Western culture. The Norse had Odin and Thor. The Greeks had Zeus and Apollo. And how about the Chinese god Pangu, who created people out of clay? That sounds like another story you may be more familiar with. And then there are Earth Mother stories in almost every culture. And Greek, Japanese, and Middle Eastern mythos all have a story about someone who made a journey to the underworld, the land of death, and then returned. Oh, and have you heard the story of the Andean peoples of South America, who repopulated the world after a great flood? Surely they never heard of Noah. A lot of myths from various cultures contain images about the creation of the world, about a deluge or great flood, and about death being an affliction given to us by some all-powerful being. But I want to be sure to convey that the ancient stories of humanity are not the only myths. A few definitions might be helpful. Theology has been described as making meaning in the world. One might say that mythopoesis, which I'll explain shortly, is another way of doing that in the artful language of metaphor. Myths are stories with morals, symbolism, and other culturally meaningful information. And a mythos is the interrelated set of beliefs, attitudes, and values held by a society or cultural group. Mythography, such as the work of Joseph Campbell, is the documentation of ancient mythologies, the stories that uphold a society's mythos and ethos. And finally, mythopoesis, and this is what I really wanted to get to today. Mythopoesis is the active and creative development of a new mythos to fit the needs of a particular group. We have our own personal creation myths, which may be more current than ancient stories. Individually, we often talk about where we came from and our families of origin. All of the stories we tell are, of course, filtered through the memories of the small children we once were. There are also stories we tell about our society, our nation, in regards to our local history, and even about our church. To talk about myths is not to say we are talking about falsehoods. I believe that stories contain a kernel of metaphorical truth that have meaning for us. Sometimes a person can get caught up in the details, not seeing the forest through the trees, as the saying goes. But if we step back and look at the story, at the creation or foundational myth in question, perhaps we can glean more than simply, once upon a time, so-and-so started something. Some theologians and seminarians and ministers, including myself, are fans of something I might call narrative theology, and it fits well with the mythopoeic process. A literalist might define theology as the study of God, although quite a few theologians have put forth the idea that theology is the process by which people make sense of life and the world around us. Reinhold Niebuhr, in particular, expounded upon that definition of theology. In the narrative, the story, dare we say, the myth, is the account of the ideas that arise when we each try to make sense of life and the world around us. The way in which I use narrative theology has far more to do with the journey than the destination. When some major thing happens in my life, the entire process that I go through to make sense of that major thing is far more valuable to me than simply the end conclusion by itself. And so in making sense of something, we develop a narrative, a story, yes, a myth about it. Another piece of narrative theology is that these narratives typically arise in community. I can tell a story, but it doesn't become part of the community's library unless a great many others in the community had a part in its formulation. This usually happens organically, sometimes kind of like a game of telephone, if you ever played that. Snippets of the story are passed around by various people in a community until they end up with a narrative that everyone pretty much accepts as being a good explanation for what it is they're trying to understand. The scientists here might point out the lack of objective analysis and empirical evidence in such stories, and they would be correct. Stories rarely have a base in only solid facts because they are filtered through the minds of many people who interpret what they see and hear, assign meaning and intentions, and create a narrative that speaks to the heart more than the mind. Oh yes, and you might say that heart, which we imbue with emotional consciousness, is also an archetype. It certainly has no medical basis, in fact, but we talk about our hearts all the time. We shall return to this subject in a few moments.
Each of us plays a part in the story of our beloved community, whether we've been here for a day or for decades. Perhaps the thing that keeps many of us here is the memories we treasure and the hope of forming more memories as our collective story unfolds. Last week, we watched 4 of our young people speak about their experiences in this sacred space. They were coming to the end of their time in high school. Some of us had known some of them since they were literally babies. We taught them in youth religious education classes. We caught them as they slid down the slide in the backyard. We also treasure memories of inspiring messages we've heard from ministers and lay people alike. Favorite songs like Blue Boat Home bring a tear to many an eye. We have memories of deep conversations that made us see our lives or our world from a different perspective. Memories of laughing and crying with friends we hold dear. All these things are a priceless part of our community, yet we know that this community requires financial support to continue providing the opportunity to form these memories that become part of our personal and collective stories. Now is the time to provide that support, either online or through mailing a check. Please give as generously as you are able.
Thanks, Vera. Let us return to our examination of stories as a form of collective meaning making. This entire process of developing a narrative, developing mythos has a name, mythopoesis. It is a constructive, creative, and metaphorical process by which any group develops the mythos or collection of narratives, stories, that define that group's place in their surrounding world. One might think of the stories people in this church tell and about who we are and how we interact with our surrounding community. Several years ago, I was an adjunct professor for one semester at Starr King School for the Ministry, where I taught a course on this topic, but as it relates to paganism in particular. It's been my opinion for quite some time that the wider pagan community has been a bit more honest than the rest of the world about their relationship to myth. I think the earth-based spiritual community, that is, modern pagans, have embraced this process of mythopoesis with open arms. The rest of us accept new stories developed in community as well, but we just don't always recognize this process for what it is. So I wonder, what about the mythos of Unitarian Universalism? Our spiritual community has a great many stories that we tell about ourselves. We are a social justice movement working hard to make the world a better place. I think you've all heard me talk about that once or twice. We also have an interesting story about the origin of our flaming chalice symbol. And if we look back at our UU heroes, I can think of several, we have some interesting stories about them as well. All of the stories probably have some basis in fact, but some of it may be somewhat apocryphal. I think about Joseph Murray and John Potter and how Universalism was brought to America. This is the story about Murray's ship getting caught on a sandbar off the coast of New Jersey and being stuck there for days. The story goes that Potter kept trying to get Murray to come and preach his Universalist message, and Murray kept putting him off. I'm on a ship, we're going to be sailing away. But finally Murray said that if his ship was still stuck on the sandbar on Sunday, he would come and preach. And so Universalism was born in America and never left. We really don't know if the story is true or not, but I've heard it many times. I also think of a person that has been called the Apostle of Liberty, the minister, Thomas Starr King, about whom Abraham Lincoln is believed to have said, Starr saved California for the Union during the Civil War. In the 4 years that Starr served the San Francisco church, he is said to have ridden up and down the state on horseback, preaching to miners and farmers and townspeople about the evils of slavery and the need for California to side with the Union. Simultaneously, he was going to many different halls and speaking with rich socialists, raising money for the American Sanitary Commission, which is now known as the American Red Cross, so that they could provide medical care on the Civil War battlefields. And in between all of these horseback trips, Starr managed to preach every Sunday at church and provide pastoral care for his congregation. To accomplish all of that is an awful lot of responsibility to put on one guy's shoulders, not to mention his horse. So it's no wonder he died young. There are quite a few more UU myths, but I think you get the point. Not all the stories we tell, though, are about real life. Mythopoesis is nowhere so obvious as in some works of fiction. Examples include The Lord of the Rings by Tolkien, A Wrinkle in Time by Madeleine L'Engle, Dune by Frank Herbert, and many more. In the case of many of these authors, they write not only to entertain, but also to generate thinking about major issues of the time. Robert Heinlein was particularly known for this, writing novels that criticized governmental excesses, the ethics of war as a way of controlling society, and even about social conventions around marriage and sexuality. It seems to me that mythos has a place in our society, no matter how modern and rational we have become. The stories we tell are not always fantasy. They are not always completely devoid of fact, but they are always full of meaning. We often use metaphor as a way of explaining something indirectly that we're not able to explain directly. The stories we tell are important. We feel them in our metaphorical hearts. They connect us with our community since we share a common story. In the writings of Joseph Campbell, he suggested that our myths, our communal narrative, is what drives us. We act on our beliefs based on what we feel in our hearts because of the story about ourselves that we all share. This is not a good or a bad thing, it just simply is. I find it wise, however, for us to be aware of it. Have you ever experienced something in which people talk about things that have happened? Have you thought about how those experiences are expressed through the filter of that person's interpretation or perception? If the story is not a good one, is it possible for the community to change the narrative? Change how we understand it and how we choose to continue to be together as a community? These narratives show up everywhere in our lives. Yes, here in our church, also in our families and circles of friends, in our work or community, in our wider society and our nation. There are many ways of coming to understand the story, and because mythopoesis is an active, creative process, the story is forever being written. It is not static. It is not chiseled in stone. We can change it together. We are each a prophet of our destinies. There are so many stories about what has happened to you, what has happened to me, what has happened to this congregation or our community or any other group or situation we have in our lives. Lately, many of us have been thinking of the story currently developing for our nation. We have in our power, that mythopoeic power, to take control of our narrative and create the story we wish to be living in. We need not be stuck with one way of thinking. If we allow ourselves to do so, we are continually able to develop our stories in ways that bring us joy. And on that note, I'd say, may it ever be so, and blessed be you all. I invite you again to join your voices in song. Our closing hymn is Come Sing a Song With Me. It's number 346 in the gray hymnal.
Come sing a song with me. Come sing a song with me. Come sing a song with me, that I might know your mind. And I'll bring you hope when hope is hard to find. And I'll bring a song of love and a rose in the winter time. Come dream a dream with me. Come dream a dream with me. Come dream a dream with me, that I might know your mind. And I'll bring you hope when hope is hard to find. And I'll bring a song of love and a rose in the
In benediction, I'd like to end with a prayer by my colleague, the Reverend Kathleen Rollins. Spirit of life, revealed to us and all who companion our days and share the work of our hands, we pause to give thanks. We are grateful for communities of conscience which inspire us to step outside of ourselves and make real those values and beliefs which move us to action. We give thanks for the truth tellers in our lives, prophets and poets whose passion for justice stir in us a renewed hope of a world made fair and all her people one, turning us now into one more prophet. May it ever be so, and blessed be you all.